Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snow began falling lightly as we started our hike. It was supposed to be a quick winter camping trip. Just me, my childhood friend Evan, and his younger sister Lena. The weather forecast had called for light flurries, nothing that would disrupt our plans. But by the time we reached the campsite deep in the forest, the snow had thickened, and the temperature had dropped far more than expected. We set up the tent in a clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. The storm had started to pick up, and we could feel the wind cutting through our layers as we worked. By the time we got inside the tent, the snowstorm was in full force. The fabric flapped violently, and the sound of the wind drowned out everything else. "This is worse than I thought," Evan muttered, zipping his coat up to his chin. "We'll wait it out," I said, trying to sound optimistic. "It can't last forever." Lena didn't look so sure. She stared at the entrance of the tent, her face pale. "Did you guys hear that?" "Hear what?" Evan asked, glancing at me. "Like footsteps," Lena said. "Out there." We all paused, listening. The wind was deafening, making it almost impossible to hear anything else. "You're probably imagining things," Evan said, brushing it off. But I wasn't so sure. I thought I'd heard something too, a faint crunching sound, like snow being stepped on. We decided to ignore it, chalking it up to nerves and the natural noises of the forest. But as the night wore on, the storm only got worse and the sense of unease grew stronger. At around midnight, it happened again. This time it was unmistakable, a distinct sound of snow crunching just outside the tent. "What the hell was that?" Evan whispered, sitting up. Lena looked terrified, her wide eyes fixed on the tent walls. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it at the entrance. "Probably just an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. Evan unzipped the tent slightly and stuck his head out, shining his flashlight into the swirling snow. "See anything?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Nothing," he replied, zipping it back up. "But it's a damn blizzard out there. If something's out there, we wouldn't see it until it was right in front of us." That wasn't comforting. We tried to go back to sleep, but none of us could relax. The wind howled, and every so often we'd hear the faint sound of footsteps circling the tent. Around 2 a.m., Lena shook me awake. Her face was pale, her voice trembling. "There's someone out there," she whispered. "What?" I asked groggily. She pointed to the side of the tent. A faint shadow moved across the fabric, like someone walking past. I sat up, my heart racing, and shook Evan awake. "What is it now?" he muttered. Before I could answer, a voice called out from the storm. "Hello?" It was soft, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakably human. "Did you hear that?" Lena whispered. "Yeah," Evan said, his face tense. "Hello?" The voice came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the snow, but there was no one there. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice barely carrying over the wind. No response. "We need to stay inside," I said, zipping the tent back up. "Whatever's out there, it's not normal." Evan frowned. "What if it's someone who's lost? We can't just ignore it." "Did that voice sound normal to you?" I asked. Before he could reply, the footsteps started again, circling the tent. The shadow returned, moving unnaturally like it was gliding rather than walking. Lena was shaking now, her breath coming in short gasps. "This isn't happening. This can't be real." "Calm down," Evan said, though he sounded just as scared. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." It sounded close, as if it was right outside the tent. Evan grabbed a knife from his pack, holding it tightly. "We're not just sitting here." He unzipped the tent and stepped out before I could stop him. "Evan," I hissed, grabbing my flashlight and following him. The storm was blinding. Snow whipped through the air, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. "Where are you?" Evan shouted. There was no response, just the howling wind. "Help me," the voice came again, faint and distant. Evan turned toward the sound, his boots crunching through the snow. "Evan, wait!" I called, chasing after him. We stumbled through the forest, the snow nearly up to our knees. The voice seemed to lead us deeper and deeper, always just out of reach. Finally, we came to a clearing. In the center stood an old wooden cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. "What the hell is this?" Evan muttered, his breath visible in the freezing air. The voice came again, but this time it was inside the cabin. "Help me." Evan moved toward the door, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said. "This isn't right." But he shook me off and pushed the door open. The interior was dark and freezing, with frost clinging to the walls. A single candle burned on a table, its flame barely flickering. "Is anyone here?" Evan called. There was no response. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, like something was pressing down on us. "We need to go," I said, pulling at his arm. Before we could leave, the door slammed shut behind us. Lena screamed, and I spun around, my flashlight beam shaking. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, shifting and twisting unnaturally. The voice came again, but now it was all around us. "Stay with me." The candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Evan and Lena and pulling them toward the door. It took all our strength to force it open, and we stumbled out into the storm, running blindly through the snow. The voice followed us, echoing through the trees. "Don't leave. Stay." We didn't stop until we reached our campsite. Our tent was gone, buried under a thick layer of snow. "We have to keep going," I said, my voice shaking. We abandoned everything, running down the trail as fast as we could. When we finally reached the car, the storm began to ease. The snow stopped falling, and the wind died down. None of us said a word during the drive home. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that forest, but sometimes on cold winter nights, I swear I can still hear that voice. "Stay with me."
Story number 2.
The snow started falling lightly as we parked at the trailhead, but by the time we'd hiked a mile into the forest, it had turned into a steady storm. My friends and I had planned this winter camping trip for months. Me, my best friend Marcus, and his girlfriend Claire. The forecast had mentioned light snow, but this was far heavier than any of us had anticipated. "We should turn back," Claire said, brushing snow off her jacket. "It's not that bad," Marcus replied, like his usual stubborn grin plastered on his face. "We're already halfway to the campsite." I hesitated, looking at the snow-covered trail ahead. The map showed a small clearing another mile up, and Marcus was right. We were closer to the site than the car. But something about the snowstorm felt off. The air seemed heavier, and the silence of the forest was unnerving. Reluctantly, I nodded, and we pressed on. By the time we reached the clearing, the snow was falling so heavily that our tracks disappeared almost as quickly as we made them. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature had dropped sharply. We hurried to set up the tent, our hands numb despite our gloves. Once we were inside, the storm seemed louder, the walls of the tent rippling with every gust of wind. We lit a small propane heater and huddled around it trying to warm up. "Cheers to surviving the great snowstorm of 2025, Marcus said, raising a bottle of water like it was champagne. Claire didn't laugh. "I don't like this," she muttered, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. "It's just a storm," Marcus said, but his usual bravado sounded forced. As the hours dragged on, the wind grew stronger, and the snow piled up outside the tent. The heater sputtered out, leaving us in the cold. Marcus tried to relight it, but the fuel was gone. "I'll get the spare canister," he said, reaching for the tent flap. I grabbed his arm. "Don't. We can wait until morning." He hesitated, but eventually nodded. That's when we heard it. At first, it was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, a voice calling out from the forest. "Hello?" We froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered. "Probably just the wind," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." Claire's eyes widened. "Someone's out there." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Who would be out here in this storm? Marcus unzipped the tent, shining his flashlight into the swirling snow. "Hello? Do you need help?" The light illuminated the falling snow and the dense trees beyond. There was no sign of anyone. "Help me," the voice called again, closer now. "We have to check it out," Marcus said, grabbing his coat. "No," I said firmly. "This doesn't feel right." "It could be someone who's lost," Claire said, already pulling on her boots. Reluctantly, I followed them into the storm. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind stung our faces as we trudged toward the sound. "Hello?" Marcus called, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. The voice answered immediately. "This way. Hurry." The three of us exchanged uneasy glances, but kept moving. The voice led us deeper into the forest, where the trees grew closer together and the snow seemed untouched. Eventually, we came to a small clearing. In the center was an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. A faint light flickered in one of the windows. "Who the hell lives out here?" I muttered. Marcus approached the door and knocked. "Hello? We heard you calling for help." There was no response. The cabin was eerily silent. "I don't like this," Claire whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. Marcus pushed the door open and the three of us stepped inside. The air was colder than outside and a strange smell lingered, something metallic and sharp. The cabin was nearly empty, with only a broken table and a few scattered chairs. In the corner, a single candle burned on the floor, its flame flickering weakly. "This is weird," Marcus said, shining his flashlight around the room. There were no footprints in the snow on the floor, no sign that anyone had been there recently. "Let's go," I said, backing toward the door. Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind us, Claire screamed, and Marcus spun around, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling harder. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't outside. It was inside the cabin, surrounding us. "Stay with me." The candle flickered violently, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. "Turn on the flashlight," Claire yelled. Marcus fumbled with it, but the beam barely lit up the room. Shadows seemed to move in the corners, shifting and twisting. "Stay," the voice said again, louder this time, almost angry. The shadows grew darker, closing in around us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Claire's hand and pulling her toward the door. Marcus threw his weight against it, and it finally burst open. The three of us stumbled out into the storm, running blindly through the snow. The voice followed us, echoing through the trees. "Come back! Stay!" We didn't stop until we reached the tent. It was buried in snow, but we didn't care. We grabbed what we could and kept running toward the trailhead. When we finally reached the car, the storm began to ease. The wind died down and the snow stopped falling. As Marcus started the engine, I glanced back toward the forest. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its face pale and hollow. I blinked, and it was gone. We never spoke about what happened that night, but none of us ever went back to that forest. Sometimes when I'm alone on a quiet winter night, I think I can still hear the voice. Stay with me.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm began earlier than predicted, and by the time we realized it, we were already miles from civilization. It was supposed to be a quick weekend camping trip. Just me, my brother Alex, and my friend Sarah. We'd been drawn to the remote beauty of the mountains in winter, but now the beauty had turned dangerous. "What's the plan?" Sarah asked as we trudged through knee-deep snow. Alex checked his GPS, the screen flickering faintly in the growing cold. "There's a clearing about half a mile ahead. We'll set up camp there. The storm should pass by morning." I didn't say anything, but I could feel the unease building in my chest. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow was coming down so hard it blurred the world around us. The forest felt strangely alive, as if it was watching us. When we reached the clearing, we worked quickly to set up the tent. The wind whipped at the fabric, and it took all three of us to anchor it down. By the time we crawled inside, we were exhausted, our faces numb from the cold. "Good thing we brought extra layers," Alex said, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah managed a weak smile, but her usual energy was gone. She'd been quiet since the storm started, her eyes darting to the trees as if she expected something to emerge from them. As night fell, the storm grew worse. The wind roared and the snow piled up around the tent. We huddled together, sharing body heat and trying to stay warm. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound, a faint knock like something tapping against the tent fabric. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "What was it?" "Probably just a branch," Alex said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping came again, louder this time. "Hello?" a voice called from outside. We froze. It was a man's voice, muffled by the storm, but distinct. "Who's out there?" Alex called back. "Help me," the voice said. "I'm lost." My stomach tightened. The voice was strange, flat, emotionless, and too calm for someone lost in a storm. Alex grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. Snow poured in as he shone the beam into the darkness. "Hello?" he called again. The light illuminated nothing but swirling snow and shadows. "There's no one there," Sarah said, her voice shaking. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I'm so cold." Alex stepped out of the tent, despite my protests. "If someone's out here, we can't just leave them." I reluctantly followed, with Sarah close behind. The storm was blinding, and the wind howled so loudly it was hard to hear anything else. "Where are you?" Alex shouted into the void. "This way," the voice called, somehow clear despite the storm. We followed the sound, our flashlights barely cutting through the snow. The voice led us deeper into the forest, away from the safety of our campsite. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled into another clearing. In the center stood an old wooden cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. "Where did this come from?" Sarah whispered. "I didn't see it on the map," Alex said, frowning. The voice came again, but it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the cabin. "Help me, please." Alex approached the door and knocked. "Hello? Are you in there?" There was no response, just the eerie silence of the storm. Against my better judgment, Alex pushed the door open. The cabin was dark and freezing, with frost clinging to the walls. A faint light flickered in the corner, a single candle burning on a small wooden table. "This is creepy," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no sign of anyone, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. "We should go," I said, my breath visible in the frigid air. Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind us. Sarah screamed, and Alex ran to the door, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Who's there?" Alex shouted, his voice echoing in the empty cabin. The candle flickered violently, and the room grew colder. Then we heard it, a faint whisper coming from the walls. "Stay with me." My heart pounded as I spun around, trying to find the source of the voice. Shadows danced across the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the flickering candlelight. "Let us out!" Sarah cried, pounding on the door. The whisper grew louder, overlapping with itself until it became a deafening roar. "Stay with me!" The candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam shaking as I pointed it around the room. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, closing in on us. "We have to get out of here," Alex shouted. Suddenly, the door flew open, and icy wind rushed in. We didn't hesitate. We ran, stumbling through the snow as the storm raged around us. The voice followed us, echoing through the trees. "Don't leave. Stay." When we finally reached our tent, it was half buried in snow, the fabric torn and the poles bent. We grabbed what little we could carry and ran back toward the trailhead. The storm began to ease as we descended the mountain, and by the time we reached the car, the snow had stopped completely. None of us spoke during the drive home. A few days later, I tried to find information about the cabin, but there was nothing, no record of a structure in that area, no mention of it on any maps. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night, but sometimes when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can still hear that voice. Stay with me. Story the end.